Other questions for Bill? Tom?
I was unclear about the animation allowance. You said 8-second minimum
8-second
static display.
Mhm.
Any allowance for animation, so like a waving flag or a kid riding a bicycle, anything like that?
No animation would be allowed. So that's they essentially adopt the same language as
So
the
image,
IDAPA regulations.
Image.
And a transition, and there can be limited
Transition.
animation and transition, like a wiping or a scrolling of
Okay.
between messages. That transition could only a maximum of 2 seconds for that transition from message to message.
Okay.
No bike riding.
No bike riding. No flag waving
On a bike.
on a bike. Or off.
Wayne?
And just to be clear, Bill, this, the square footage is a finite amount. As in Tri-State's situation, because of additional landscaping and a variety of things, they were allowed to increase the size of the sign under the current sign ordinance. As the commission or the committee put forth, this was a finite size, right? 150 or 100, whichever we decide on, and landscaping does not allow you to go any larger.
The sign itself could be larger, but the dynamic display component of it could not be larger. So,
Correct.
just maybe to provide a little bit of background, under the city code, essentially freestanding signs are generally limited to 100 square feet in size. There is an additional bonus of sign area that can be granted if you provide landscaping at the base of that sign. Essentially, it's 1/2 square foot for every 1 square foot of landscaping that's placed at the base of the sign. So you can have a single entity freestanding sign that is 200 square feet in size if you put 200 square feet of landscaping at the base of that sign. So that's the example of the Tri-State sign that is just under 200 square feet in size that only advertises really a single entity. There's an additional provision where you have a sign that is advertising more than one entity. So take, for example, a mall setting where you can have an additional 10 square feet for each additional entity that is advertised on that sign in addition to the landscaping or independent of the landscaping. So you really cap out right now in the sign code as about 300 square feet for a freestanding sign. As you mentioned before, underneath the existing emergency ordinance, any dynamic display is limited to 100 square feet. The subcommittee's recommendation was 150 square feet. And the sign itself could be larger if there are additional entities that are advertised or if there's landscaping at the base, but the dynamic display component of that sign would be limited to 150 square feet.
Yes. Oh, I just had a thought. Our two beautiful Welcome to Moscow signs have a lot of landscaping underneath. Do you happen to know what the square footage of those signs are, just to get an idea of the sign size?
Square footage of the sign, I honestly don't. I mean, I could take a guess that they're probably around 40 to
all, really?
60 square feet in size.
Not very big.
They're not that large. They may seem large because they're kind of low to the ground, closer to you rather than being up elevated, but I would suspect that they're not more than 60 square feet in size.
Walter?
Under what we are considering tonight, there's no change in non-DDS signs proposed.
There is one change in non-DDS signs that is proposed. The committee was recommending that the brightness standards be applied to non-DDS signs.
Okay, I heard that.
Yeah,
Well,
but that is the only thing, correct?
size, no change.
Correct.
Thank you, Bill. We appreciate all your work on that and that of the committee that worked on it as well.
And I would note that I thought it was included in the packet, and it wasn't. There was a letter from the Chamber of Commerce that was provided to the Plan and Zoning Commission. I put it in front of you this evening so you could have a chance to review that prior to the meeting.
Yes, and we do have that signed by Executive Director Gina Terusio, and it's here on the dais, so thank you. This is a legislative hearing tonight, so it's a little less regimented than some of the hearings we sometimes hold here, but before the council begins its deliberation, I'll invite people who are interested in this topic to come forward to our lectern and state their name and address for our record, and just tell us what you think about what you've heard in this presentation, what you've read about this, how it would affect you or the community as a whole, and just provide information that you think will be helpful to the council in its deliberation on this topic. With that, I'll open the public hearing and invite you to come forward to the lectern.
Good evening. I'm Gina Terusio with the Chamber of Commerce, and most of my hours I reside at 411 South Main. I think Mr. Belknap did a very good job of portraying just how exhaustive this process was. And when I was asked to serve on the task force, I had no idea how really glamorous it was going to be to stand in Tri-State's parking lot in the rain while the brightness of the sun burned out my retinas. It was very, very exhaustive. And I think not only was it exhaustive, but it was very thorough and very balanced. You saw the committee or the task force makeup. It was excellent. So what you have before you is a letter that I wrote. I felt pretty strongly about the amount of work and the amount of consideration and the amount of effort put forth by the committee. I had a few key conversations over the last January 9th until now, and I will tell you that the Chamber of Commerce is as supportive of the ordinance before you, the planning and zoning recommendations, as we were the other one. I think they are both very thoughtful, and for me, the 50 square foot difference size-wise and the nits difference is still a very balanced and very solid decision. So we are in favor of this before you tonight from Planning and Zoning.
Very good. Thank you for the input. Appreciate that. Would anyone else like to testify? Okay, seeing no one else come forward, then I'll close the public hearing and open it up for the council's discussion.
I was waiting for the gavel.
I have one of those.
Start beating it on the table.
From the subcommittee,
Well,
Wayne.
the two members of the Planning and Zoning Commission who served on the subcommittee were fairly strongly in favor of keeping the 150 square feet and the 100. I think partly because they were business members that were on that committee, the task force, and that they were all very thoughtful about that. So actually, I myself would like to stick to the task force's recommendations. I mean, they worked long and hard on it, and I think we could try that. And if it was some horrible disaster came that we decided that we need to make the sign smaller, we could certainly go back and do that. One of the interesting things that I read in the minutes that were in our packet was that someone who testified at the public hearing for planning and zoning was saying it's not so much the size of the sign as how close it is to the street, how much it is right in front of you, and what percentage of your vision, your field of vision, does it take up? And they couldn't, no one could figure out how you would measure that. Is this 50% where, if you're in a truck, if you're dead? And yet that is a very it really affects how you perceive a sign, but there's no way they could measure it. So at the moment, I wouldn't die if the smaller sign ordinance, smaller sign numbers came into being in the ordinance, but I kind of wanted to go with the task force.
Tom?
Well, I myself, I kind of like the size of the sign that's at the University in Best Western, which is 74, I think we saw there. I don't like the larger sign that we have in town, and my preference would be that we would stick with our original recommendation of 100 square feet. I was glad to see that the Planning and Zoning Commission brought the 150 down to 100 for the particular size of an individual sign. I just think it is more reflective of the character of the size of the city than the larger signs would be. I think it's easier in the future if we decide to make it, go to 150. I think it's easier to go that way than it is to start shrinking the signs. So my preference would be that we pick the 100 now. My preference would be that we don't do it at all. I'm not a big fan of the signs, but I do think that the smaller signs are much more tasteful, from a size perspective. I'm concerned that I want to make sure that the brightness is enforceable and enforced as we move forward. It concerns me that during the test period we saw that there was one actually brighter than what we had set guidelines for, and then it wasn't enforced. Perhaps we didn't have the ability to enforce that piece of it, but I'd like to make sure that we don't create more problems. So that's my preference, would be to go with the P&Z recommendations.
Tim?
Thank you, Mayor Cheney. I've followed this since since Planning and Zoning first presented their letter to us of concern. And although I didn't sit in on the committee, I did attend some of the Planning and Zoning Commission discussions. I greatly appreciate the Chamber's willingness to come and as not only a member of the committee, but also representing her constituency. I appreciate that, and I'm going to support the ordinance that's now before us.
And we actually have two, so supporting
the Planning and Zoning
the
Commission
Planning and Zoning Commission
recommendations.
recommendation. Okay. Walter?
I agree with Tim and Tom. We've already got one sign that we've, by emergency ordinance, and now the discussion tonight is larger than what it seems that this body would like to have in the city of Moscow. We're grandfathering it in, but if you allow the larger, and Sue, in your comment, I think was you can always go back. You can go back and not allow any others. But as Gerard Connolly pointed out when he was here speaking to us and realized all of a sudden that his former company had the largest sign in town and nothing was going to happen to it, he decided he'd said enough and decided to hit the door. So I agree with Tom. It's easier to go up than it is to go
that's
backwards,
true.
to go down.
But remember, that Tri-State is 194, not 150.
I agree.
Okay.
So
No, I understand.
your comment that we can make it, we can bring it down later. Well, you're not going to bring down a 150 to 100
That's
any
true.
more than you're going to bring the 194 down to 150 or 100. So
That's true.
I would support the P&Z recommendation.
Dan?
Since everybody's so full of sweetness and light, I'd like to
You
make
gonna
a
mess it
motion.
up?
No, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the ordinance as presented by the Planning and Zoning Commission under suspension of the rules, requiring 3 complete and separate readings in it that be read by title and published by summary.
Okay, we have Dan's motion. Do I hear a second?
I'll second it.
Tim's second. Okay, and further discussion? Was that a finger up, Tim, or your?
No, that was I'll
Any
second.
discussion before voting?
I do have one question, which may be outside of the specific ordinance, but there was the one slide that we saw of the ITD recommendations that I had a question for Bill on. So, and that is, there is that sign on the south end of town that we always reference that's far too bright, but outside of our ability to regulate, because it's outside of the city limits. Is ITD working on the brightness of that sign at all? Anything? Do you know if there's anything that's happening there?
Bill, sure. So this is a question pertaining to the vote that's about to happen, or this is subsequent to that?
Okay, he showed that slide, and I had that question. I can ask it after we vote, but it seems like once we vote, we're moving on to the next thing, so I just wanted to ask the question.
Okay, so the
If I
question
may.
is
The
about
question is-
enforceability, kind of? and-
Bill, do you know if ITD is doing anything about that one sign that?
I do not know what action they may or may not be taking right now. I know that they have tried to work with the sign owner to dim it down, but I
Okay.
don't know to what extent. I mean, Doug did make some comments about that during the subcommittee meetings. Their standard is very general when it talks about shall not cause glare upon the roadway, and so they don't have a numeric standard that they can apply.
Okay.
So I don't know what the current state of any action ITD may be taking with respect to that sign.
Okay, thanks.
And did I see staff having another question before the council votes on this? Did you have some clarification? Okay. So the motion before us, put forward by Dan and seconded by Tim, is to approve the ordinance as recommended by the Planning and Zoning Commission under suspension of the rules. Okay. And is that, everybody knows what's
So
going on?
forth and so on.
Very good. We'll start the roll call vote with you, Dan.
Aye.
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 Oh, and I can't disagree with the logic that you can't go smaller, so I.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, that motion carries unanimously. So that's ordinance number 2013-02, an ordinance of the City of Moscow, Idaho, Municipal Corporation of the State of Idaho, providing for the amendment of Moscow City Code Title 4, Chapter 6, providing for the establishment of a definition and standards for dynamic display signs within the Moscow Sign Code, providing that the provisions of this ordinance be deemed severable, and providing for this ordinance to be in full force and effect from the date of its passage, approval, and publication according to law. And thanks to all who put so much thought and risk their retinas for the whole thing. Gina, thank you. Standing out in the rain and the whole bit. Both the task force / committee and the Planning and Zoning Commission and all those who've weighed in on this so thoughtfully.